Okay, so thank you everybody for coming. This is a joint paper with my classmate Zibing. It's about migration and housing constraints and the inequality in China. So the general question of this paper is that when we observe a lot of things going on, especially in these developing countries like China, we do observe a rapid growing. We have a very specific spatial characteristics. So the first thing we do see is that workers migrate from less developed cities to more developed cities. Second, we do observe a rapid growth of housing costs and simultaneously housing wealth, especially in these more developed cities. And then we also observe an enlarged income inequality within and across cities. So putting them together, we have some general questions. The first question is like, what are the exogenous driving forces of these observations? Like, what makes these things happen? The second is that, are these observations, like these 3 bullet points, are they endogenously connected? And how are they connected? And finally, in a policy perspective, it's like anything we can do to lower this enlarged income inequality, because this is a very serious problem now when this inequality gets to a very high level. So here is our story in this paper. So we have it organized in this figure on the left-hand side, that when you think about the blue parts is what we observe, and the black parts are what we are not observed. So let me start with the exogenous forces. So when we think about the migration model, we actually have 3 things. One, the first thing is like, how is the migration cost going on? So in this paper, we actually find that there's a universally dramatic drop in the migration cost. And second, there's also an unevenly productivity growth across different cities. And finally, we have a land supply, which is also unevenly supplied across different cities. So having this together, it will have endogenous response in both migration and housing. So first, we do observe a dramatic migration flow from low productivity to high productivity. At the same time, we do observe the housing costs and housing wealth increase dramatically in the high productive cities. And then we're moving to the third layer of this figure, is that how would this end up with the observed inequality? Is that the housing wealth income in the high productive city is actually not evenly distributed to everybody. That's because the initial housing ownership is very unevenly distributed. If you think about a world that grows in 5 years and these dramatic changes, it all goes to the local owners. So why are the migrants not getting any housing? There's complicated reasons that we don't cover in this paper, but I could address 2. First is like financial constraint, because the migrants are usually lower income, and it's hard for them to get the credit to pay, especially in China, like at least the 30% mortgage, 30% down payment is really hard for them to afford. And second thing is that there's also regulations in these larger cities that rule out the ability of the migrants to access the housing market. So together with all these features, we do observe 2 inequality patterns. The first is actually national income inequality actually drop across regions, actually drop, because when you move from low productivity to high productivity, your wage income doubled or tripled. So the national level is actually dropping. But the income inequality within these high productive cities actually spikes. So let me show you later all the details. So this is a short talk, so let me go over the backgrounds and the literature very fast. So the first thing is that when we talk about China, China's history fits this scenario perfectly. So this story potentially also holds, very likely also holds for Korean in 30 years earlier, Japan in 40 years earlier, and a lot of East and South Asian countries in like right now. And what is more specific about China would be like China has a little bit different to these countries, that we have a very restrictive land supply policy in the larger cities. So this will be I will talk in more details about this when we go to the counterfactual. So the core literature of this paper fits in 3 strands of literature. One is the migration and productivity gain. One is the migration and the housing constraints. And finally, we're looking at the income inequality. So this is the first paper to study migration flows interacting with housing constraints for income inequality, and more specifically, the spatial distribution of income inequality. So what we do exactly in this paper, I would say like 3 parts. First, we document this significant spatial characteristic using comprehensive data. Second, we build a spatial general equilibrium to match the data facts and quantify the exogenous sources. And third, we conduct counterfactuals in order to reduce this observed income inequality. So here is the outline of this paper. So before I move on, if there's any questions, you may raise here.
So great. If anyone has a question at this point, feel free to just chime in. You can unmute yourself and ask, or you can also type something in the chat box. If anyone's formatting that, while I have one question on my head that I'll just pose right now, and it's I'm thinking now about migrants in China and potential skill gaps between rural versus urban workers. I suppose that for early migrants, those skill gaps must have not prohibited migration, because I'm imagining the rural kind of migrants having relatively lower sets of skills, at least, you know, in general. So also if you back up in time, and now maybe have new generations of earlier migrants, you have more advanced skills. But are you able to observe, like, to what extent are the jobs in the cities going to skilled workers, and are you able to pick up information about the potential migrants in rural areas and whether they have the skills to fill those jobs?
Yeah, so in the data we do, like, because we are using actual census data, so we do know like everybody's education level and which occupations they are working at. So we do observe like the like what we call like advanced industry or high-end industry, like tech sector and finance sector. We do observe like a lot of very high educated people going to these sectors, and most low skilled workers are going to manufacturing and also other skills, but in other sectors. But in general, the high skill share in China is super low. So I will show like later why why the skill premium doesn't actually matter that much, but the housing premium, like your birth location, actually matters even more for your income inequality. Okay. Yeah.
So does anybody else have any other questions?
Hi, Chris. I have a kind of question, and I'm not sure about the Chinese housing market, but is there anything about hukou system?
Yes,
You have
yes.
hukou in China, and you can just buy the house, but even you have very high income, if you have not hukou, and you cannot buy the house in China.
Yes. So that's part of the regulation that's forbidden the migrants, what we call non-hukou workers, to get into access to the housing market.
Okay. So is this a kind of indicator or impact factor in your model?
So in the model, we distinguish workers as hukou workers and non-hukou workers. So we call these non-hukou workers as migrants.
Okay.
And they don't share the profit of the local housing market.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So let me move forward. So first, let me show you the data and some stylized facts just to heat up and to give some intuition of what's going on. So the data we're using comes from 3 sources. So first is the population census. So it just survey everybody in China. We have households and individual survey. So we have like 0.2% in 2005 and 0.35% in 2010. So this data is considered the most representative data in China. And then we have the hukou registration. So China is very different to most of the country we know, for instance, US. So in China, everybody is registered to the city they are born, and they're assigned like ID, which is their hukou registration. And if you are going to another location, which is not your hukou registration, you will face a lot of regulations. For instance, Yon just mentioned, you will have limitations to enter into the housing market in a different location, which is not your hukou location. And okay, and then we have the current working location of each workers, their employment status, like which sector, and also their education level, their wage, but only in 2005. And then their rent payment and a lot of their housing characteristics, like how many toilets you have, how many windows you have, which floor, what's the size of your apartment, and who are living in this house. And then moving to the second data set, because to document inequality, we really want to have the wage from the data, not from our model inference. So we took the statistic yearbook of each city in China, which is like a printed book, and then somebody scans them to be a PDF, and then somebody to grab the numbers out of these books. And so we have the wage data for 19 sectors in roughly 250 cities. And then we take the total construction land supply in each city above from the urban statistic yearbook. And finally, we have another survey, which is urban household survey from 93 to 2009. So this sample is majorly used for just the estimation of the scale premium estimation for the elasticity of substitution between two different scales. So that's not used in the main analysis of this model and the status facts. Okay, so let me directly jump to the first fact is how does the migration flow looks like? So
Min, can I briefly ask you, I'm curious, are you going to be looking for exogenous variation in the housing supply? Like, are you going to have an instrument or something working into there?
For which part?
Housing supply.
Yes, like for which part of the housing supply, you mean like government?
I was thinking maybe for regulation.
I see.
So I imagine that could be an endogenous variable.
This is a very important part in our paper, that housing supply in each city is roughly fixed. That comes from two parts. One is the land supply quota is literally regulated by the government. So the government determines how much land each city could have. And at the same time, government determines how much intensity of construction each city could have. So if you think about the plot ratio, that's also regulated. So eventually, at the end, for each city at each time point, the total supply of floor space is fixed. So that's part of the exogenous variation.
Okay, that's helpful. When does the government ever, update these plot ratios or anything? Like I imagine Shanghai must have had adjustments as it grows or something, right?
Yes. So every year the government have some meetings, like the central government actually have meetings. So they determine, the central government will determine how much ratio and how much land supply each city could have. So there will be like slightly adjustments around the government sent quota, but it won't change much.
Okay.
So this means the floor space supply in each city is directly determined by the central government.
But let's say like there's a very productive city. I might be wrong on this, but I'm just kind of thinking like there's a very productive city like Shanghai, for example. Is the government not saying, hey, there's a ton of demand to move there, let's relax some of those plot restrictions or something to allow a greater inflow in?
I see. You're asking very important question directly to the end of this paper.
Okay,
so I will tell you something even more interesting is that the government is doing exactly the opposite.
Okay, fascinating.
So Shanghai need much more land, but the government say, no, we're not giving you land. We're giving land to somewhere in the west part of China where there's no people there. And because we're doing this because we think of land as a kind of like transfer, a central government transfer. Land is money. So to balance the development across regions, we think Shanghai is too developed, and we think other regions are less developed, so we're going to give them more money.
Okay, that's very fascinating.
How to give them more money? Yeah. Let's give them more land.
Okay, so they're trying to use land as a way to spread economic activity out, and you're talking about using land to reduce income inequality by bringing people in. That's fascinating. Okay, I'll stop interfering now. So go ahead and push ahead.
Yeah. So in end, it would be like a very terrible policy, and the goal of this paper at the very end is trying to say how bad this policy is, and how if we relax this policy, how much gain we could have. Okay. So you're actually asking a very good question. So let me start with the first fact. So this is not very new, but we just want to show like how big it is. So we do observe the migration workers highly and increasingly concentrating in certain larger cities. So how we calculate the net inflow of migration is current workers minus the hukou workers. So here is a table. I will show you like some cities initially, they're losing like this. There's one city here losing between 2 million workers and 4 million workers. That's almost half of the city. And moving to 2010, there's 6 cities that are losing this much workers. And if you look at this end, so this is blocked by the faces, but hope I can see. There's one city in 2005, which is Shenzhen only. They're gaining more than like 8 million workers. 8 million workers. That's 20 million people in 2005. And if you move to 2010, there are 4 cities. So that's what we call Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. They're gaining more than 8 million workers. And if we look at that, if we look at this in the map, so if you look here, this is the spatial distribution in 2005. So darker the blue, which means more population outflow. Warmer the red means more population inflow. So here is Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou and Shenzhen. So people are moving out almost from everywhere in China to these cities. And then if you look at what's going on in 2010, every color gets darker. So which means more and more people moving out from the middle region and west region of China. And where are they going? They're all going to Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and these more developed cities. So when we're talking about migration, it's basically people moving out from everywhere in China and to the high productive cities. And here is the time correlation. If you look at the net inflow in 2010, net inflow in 2005, and this dashed line is 45-degree line. So you can say this is way below the 45-degree line. So it's more and more concentrated. And then the second factor we're looking at is how does the housing cost looks like. So the housing cost increased dramatically with net inflow of migrants. So actually we also have like IV identified results for this. It also holds, but for simplicity, just for presentation wise, I would just talk about this plot. So this is a fitted line for 2005 and 2010, and we scale it by the net inflow in 2010. And you can see in cities like, for instance, here would be Beijing is here, and I think Shanghai is here. So these cities has much higher average rent per square meter than the other cities with net outflow of workers. And this level actually increased over time from 2005 and 2010. And now we're moving. I
think you have a question. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. I think that Carolyn has a question. Carolyn, do you want to ask it?
Yeah, can I just quickly ask? I'm sure you said that and I didn't get it probably. How do you measure the flows? Again, it's just a person with the hukou that's different from the city where they are currently living, right? That's an inflow?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, or maybe I should call it like a non-hukou workers, stock of non-hukou workers.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's anybody you wouldn't capture, but I guess even if like somebody from a sort of somewhere Western hukou first lives in Beijing and then moves to Shanghai, that would still show up in the same way in your data, right? You don't know where they are flowing from, but you know that there's somebody new in that city. Okay.
Yes, it's linked from the very starting point, which is the hukou registration when you're born to your destination. And if you're triggering around in the middle, we cannot capture that movement. So this is more like yeah.
Yeah, and now I guess people don't with children, right? You only move when you're makes sense. Okay.
Okay. So now moving to the measure of inequality, we need to define our measures. Usually we use Gini, but there's some advantage of using cell index, which because it can be spatially decomposited. So we construct two cell indexes. The first is we call income cell index. So just keep in mind, this is considered a lower bound. So we have the wage income of household I in location J, which is their wage, IJ. So we define wage just by high skill and low skill workers. And then we have the imputed rent income from their housing ownership. So if you own a house and we calculate the rent income, so that's your imputed rent income. And by wage, it will be just wage itself. So imputed rent income will be two parts. So you have your self-consumed space and you do have actual rent income. So many of households in like Beijing and Shanghai, they rent out their additional house and they also rent out maybe a room in their house and they make a living on that. So this imputed rent income is potentially a lower bound for asset income because if you think we're netting out two things, first is the housing price appreciation, which is not documented here, which could be potentially even larger source. And the second is the financial assets we're not accounted here. But by other surveys, which I'm not showing today in appendix, that this all different sources of income are highly correlated. So if you have more if you have a larger house, you probably have a higher financial asset stock, and your housing wealth appreciates even more. So we take this lower bound of that of our estimation. So now let me show you the calculation. So I probably need to go super fast here. So cell index will be like a weighted for each city J will be the weighted individual income divided by the average income in city J and times the log term, and then average over all the individuals. That will be the cell index in city J. And then the national cell index will be another weighted average of this cell index and the log term for this city's average over the national average. And then we can calculate each city's contribution share to national cell index. So for instance, to give a hint, Beijing's income cell contribution share is 21% in 2005 and jumped to 37% in 2010. So the limitations here, as we always remind our audience, is that this inequality documented here is only between major groups. So you're thinking about high skill vs low skill, local vs non-local. There's at most 8 groups in each city. Okay, so first let me introduce you the wage inequality. So you can say that the wage inequality looks super messy, and it's not significant with like more workers in the cities. And if you think about including the housing part, the within city income inequality. So for each city, you can say the cities has much more net inflow of migrants. They actually have much higher income inequality when you consider the housing stock. And this inequality is increasing over time. And then if you look at each city's contribution to the national income equality, these larger cities contribute much more to the national income equality, and it's not changing over time. So here are the takeaway of these 5 stylized facts. I just show you like how the migration looks like, how the housing cost looks like, and how the inequality pattern without considering the housing and considering the housing looks like. And now let me go to the model. So if there's any questions at this point.
Yeah, so I have a question, and maybe others will are formulating their thoughts too. And this will, I'm sure, come up in the model, but I'm wondering if before we hit that, if you can kind of prelude us on this. I'm curious, something we haven't, I haven't thought about in the past is how housing restrictions within cities might increase within city income inequality, because usually I think of that migration channel as increasing inequality between places, not within places. Is there kind of just a simplified way of how I can think about how housing restrictions in a place like Shanghai or Beijing will also increase the inequality in there? Is it strictly through that ownership of property channels, so the wealthy are accumulating rents?
So let me give you like a simple example, and this will also be very good to explain the model. So if you think that China only has two cities, one is less developed city, one is very developed city. Okay, so the low productive city have like half, or maybe I would say 80% workers and 20% workers in high developed cities, and only the locals in high developed cities has all the housing. And now the migration cost drop, so people start to move. Yes, so the low developed city has almost half of the population moving to Beijing, and then everybody in Beijing, because Beijing is a high productive city, so all these guys moving from this village to Beijing, their wage actually tripled. So you think a double triple. So if you measure the national income equality dropped a lot, yes, because these guys becomes much richer. And then if you think about within Beijing, now you have two bunch of people. The low productive guys now move to high productive to the high productivity, so they do make much more wage. But then the housing supply is very limited in this city. So everybody want a house. And who owns the house? The locals. So the locals, just by having the house, they generate a huge rent income from the housing ownership. So the inequality between the new migrants and the local also enlarged. So essentially we have like across region inequality drop, but within region inequality spikes for the larger cities. But for the smaller cities, actually the inequality dropped.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions at this point before we dig into the model? I think you can push ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So actually, I basically just explained the model. So let me go the details of the model, because the model has more details than the simple story. So to give an overview, the model is the Eaton-Coulton framework of migration with high and low skill workers. So there's location choice subject to preference, income, migration costs, and there's also local production function combining both high and low skill workers. And then we have the famous Berlin Wall paper for the floor space market, but different side is that the production is fixed. Then there's the endogenous floor space price due to both residential demands. And the local residents gain all the returns from the floor space market. So now let me start with the workers. So the worker has a Cope-Douglas utility function from both consumption goods of final goods and the consumption floor space. So the worker is worker O, moving from hometown I to destination J. And this Z would be their idiosyncratic preference shock. And this tau would be the scale-specific home and destination iceberg migration cost. So we assume this shock follows the Fisher distribution. This will give us a very nice property of the gravity equation. So by the first order conditions of choice of consumption and floor space, we will have an indirect utility function. So the indirect utility function will be product of their preference and their income. So this is Vij by scale S, and by a product of the housing cost, which is Qj, because beta is smaller than 1. And then we divide everything by the iceberg cost. So through some math, this will give us a migration flow. So how does the migration flow looks like in the gravity equation? The probability of the population workers moving from location I to location J with scale S will be this product divided by the potential migration chance to go to all the potential destination from K equal to I and to all the locations. So this term, this probability is governed by the migration elasticity epsilon. So if you look back here, here, there's the epsilon of the Fisher distribution. That's all the technical details. So I just go fast saying this is negative correlated with the migration cost. So of course, the higher the cost, the less you're moving, and negative correlated with the the local housing price because you have to rent the apartment there. And this is positive correlated with the income you could gain in your destination location. And then the income is coming from two parts. One is your wage, the city and the skill specific wage. And the second part is if you are local residents, you have the share of all the housing divided by all the local workers who stays in the city. And then we're moving to the production side. So each city has a production function, combining both high skill and low skill workers with their specific productivity. And then by first order conditions, we can derive the wage, and then we can also derive the skill premium. And finally, we're moving to the floor space market. So the floor space production will be all the floor space is a product of the intensity and the land supply. So both intensity and land supply are highly regulated. So the floor space supply is fixed at each time point. But the floor space market clearing comes from the other side is that both local and migrants, they demand the floor space consumption. So which at the same, this equation would determine the demand of floor space, which it essentially determines what's the price. So when more migrants moving into the high productive city, the price of the housing floor space will go up dramatically.
I see that Xiaolan has a question. Do you want to ask?
Yeah, just unmute.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So just a quick question. If you could go back 2 or 3 slides, so maybe we'll talk about this later. So just like the income, yes, income equals to wage plus rent.
Here.
So yes, so like I'm wondering how you model like the home ownership here. So essentially, if I understand this correctly, it means that all the migrant worker, they will not buy a property. So they will only have some wages, but they will spend their wages on rents, but they will not own a property. And all the hukou residents, they will like own a house and they will benefit from the home ownership, the rent.
Yes.
Okay. So, but the migrant workers, they cannot purchase a property in the model.
Yes.
Okay.
So we do actually check a lot of robustness for this term. So for instance, there's another setup in the appendix that we allow the migrants to have their housing income from their hometown. Like when they left, when they migrate out, they may rent to other people and they have the income. And also we check the data from the census that we do say that only 10% of migrants could indeed buy a house in their destination city. So for simplicity, we made this assumption and okay.
Yeah.
So
I have a related question.
Yeah.
Do you control for increases in house prices? So I understand that if you already own a house and then people move in, that increases your income without any cost. But if you're buying property after, then the house price will be bid up because of the higher rents, right? So that would,
yes,
in that case, you would overestimate the effect on inequality a little. Is that right?
So yeah, so now we're considering we actually underestimate because here we assume that all the housing income will only be like a flow of the rent, but not like the price appreciation. So for in other way, I would say we assume a constant. We actually assume the constant rent price ratio. We just say the housing is more like a Lucas tree that give you all the dividend, which is the rent over time, and this ratio is fixed. But in reality, actually, if you think about Beijing, the rent price ratio is actually super low, which means the price goes up much faster than the rent. So the income increment for these locals are much higher than we estimated in this paper. But we don't have any. We don't have the what?
It only holds for insiders. No? Like I see that those who own the house, yeah, they have the double effect of increasing rent, but then also increasing wealth. But if I'm trying to buy a house like now, when already the people are there, then I have to pay my mortgage as well, right?
Yeah. So you will be hurt because of the migrants. If you're like buying a house
into the market, right? But I appreciate that you can't really. That's very difficult.
Yeah. So we actually intended to get the housing price, like to give more precise stuff, but we can only get for 2015, because it's an internet stage. So we do have like some websites, they have record all this stuff. But back in 2010, we cannot get any like very detailed macro level housing price. So we have difficulty to construct the price part. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So now let me show you the estimation of the model parameters. So maybe I go too fast. You didn't even notice how many parameters in the model. Luckily, we only have 3. So the first is how much share you consume of your final goods and housing. So this share would be, our estimation is like your consumption share is like 0.77 from an average from the survey. I would just go over it. And the second is the elasticity of substitution between high skill and low skill workers. So we do have an IV and nature experiment way to construct this, but I'm worried we may spend 10 minutes here. So I'll just show you. We did estimate this using IV, and we controlled for endogeneity issues. And this gives us a number of 3. So this is a little bit higher than the estimation for US, which is 1.4. So we also did the alternative model with the parameter 1.4, and we found our results basically hold. So yeah. And finally, we need to estimate the third parameter, which is the migration elasticity. So how elastic is migration flow sensitive relative to the income that you can get in your working city. So this is done by like a large scale fixed factor regression, which we estimate this epsilon, and we estimate this number to be 1.9 using both the real macro level census wage and also like our constructed income from the city statistics yearbook. So this number doesn't vary much. So we choose a number 1.9 just in between. And so that's our estimated parameters. And now we're going to the quantitative result. So I don't want anybody to ask questions about the estimation, so I'm sorry. We can discuss later after Xiaolin's presentation if you are interested. So we need to solve first what's the observed variables, as I started at the very beginning. One is the migration cost, one is how does the productivity looks like. And now we can finally start to account for inequality in the model and how they change over time. So the first is about the migration cost. So the annual drop of migration cost is roughly 9%, so which is huge. So if you think about, think about this migration cost, it's not just like the flight ticket or the train ticket price. It's like a composition of everything. So amenity is part here. And if you think about the regulation which hurts the migrants, it's also part of here. And also if you consider like hard to get education in the destination city, it's part here. So this is more like yeah.
Yeah, so this is measured independently of your elasticity of migration, right? So when you're computing elasticities, that's deflating for migration changes in migration cost across time. Is that correct?
So it's not independent. We need that parameter to calculate this.
To calculate the migration cost.
Yes.
Okay.
So we do account that the migration cost actually universally drop. And more importantly, you could say with the migration cost drop, we have much more high skill workers start to move across different regions. And that's basically takeaway. It's just saying like the drop is very large. And second is how does the productivities looks like? So we could actually calculate the productivity for each city. So here I'm showing a summary. This is like ranking the city, grouping the city by their net inflow. So we have 233 cities. I grouped by the average migration flow. You can choose different cutoffs, but I'm just want to show the pattern across different regions, across time. So the first, if you think of across regions, if you look at the productivity, you think about Beijing, it's roughly 2, and if you think about village in the West China, it's roughly 1/5. It's only 20%. So these guys are making 20% of the wage of if he move into Beijing. And how does this change over time for high skill? It changes dramatically. So even though the percentage change for these guys are larger, but if you think about the absolute value change, it's much more for the workers in these large cities. And then if you look at low skills, the low skill gap is not that large. It's still large, but not that large. And the change over time is more like a universal. So the whole China's low skill productivity actually grows pretty much a lot and pretty much evenly across different regions. So it would be much more beneficial to promote high skill workers to move to these more productive cities. And this is kind of intuitive. And now we're going to show how the inequality looks like. So the first is the within city cell index. So I always show the same table, but just change the context. So if we look at the average wage cell index, it doesn't actually change much across time, and it doesn't differ much across regions. And if you look at income cell index, so just in mind, you incorporate this dramatic change in the housing cost, it actually doubled in 5 years. And which part does it double? The larger cities. And if you go into this, majority of the cities are losing population, no, it doesn't change almost, and it may slightly decrease. And if you think about income cell index for this like last tier cities, they lost almost half of their workers. They lost half of their workers. It becomes what we call empty city or ghost town. Their housing price actually dropped. So their income cell index actually dropped lower than the wage cell index. But because there's no much population, not much workers here, we're generally focused on the first and second tier cities. The income inequality spikes in these cities. And then if you think about how much does each city contribute to the national cell index. So the first line is the national cell index. So this first line is not the share. So the national wage inequality dropped a lot from 0.1 to almost 0.06. It's like 30% dropped, 35% drop over the 5 years. And even considering housing, it still dropped 20%. So the national income is actually convergent because we get these people in the less developed city, we give them 5 times wage. Of course, the national income dropped. But still, if you look at each city's contribution to the national sale, you can see these cities, they contribute positively to the national income equality because of their housing characteristics. And these cities, they're losing populations, they contribute negatively to the national income inequality. And finally, there's more direct observation of what looks like. We can directly measure the skill premium and housing premium. So skill premium is more like familiar. So you can see there's no changes in skill premium. And how do we measure what's so-called housing premium? Housing premium is like if you're a house owner relative to a non-house owner, what's your annual income from having the house divided by the average wage in the city. So this is 200%, which means if I'm a Beijingese, I just own an apartment, I don't work at all. I can make double the wage of an average worker in the city. I live like a god. So that's the dramatic part of the income inequality going on in China from 2005 to 2010 and potentially still now. And so that's the dramatic source of this income inequality. So the takeaway from the quantitative analysis is we back up these observed sources and we measured the inequality in a spatial characteristics. And finally, let me show you like there's one source which is very important, as Chris mentioned at the beginning, is the land supply. So let me show. I may skip how I detailed construct this counterfactual. This is more like keep the net increment of the land supply from 2005 to 2010 unchanged, but redistribute the land supply according to migration flows. Just as Chris suggested, we should give more land to where people are going. Yes. So, so let me show you how this is going on. So if you look at the land supply in 2005, so this is the top 5 cities. They have like a 5K square kilometer of the land. And moving to 2010, what's going on? They got 10% more land. But if you think about workers, they got 30–40% more workers, but they only got 10% more land. And which group of city got the most of land? The second group, but they got even more workers. And then if you look at the cities, if you look at the bottom 2 numbers here, the cities, they're losing population. They got 30–40% more land supply. And if you construct the counterfactual by the net inflow of the workers, where should the land be redistributed? Just the new land supply during the 5 years. It should all go to the top 2 tier of the cities. They should get all the additional land. And because of, we're considering taking out of the land from your current land stock would be very costly, so we don't give you additional land. So this shouldn't get any new quarters during this 5 years. So this is considered a policy that is feasible to do during these 5 years. And if we do this policy, what will happen? So first, you could observe we boost 10% more migrations into these larger cities. The whole nation. And we boost 18% more into the first tier city, 8% more in the second tier city. And then we should have population outflow from these cities. So we should encourage more migrants into these high productive cities. And because the total land supply in these larger cities increased dramatically, so even though we encourage the 18% more migrants into the city, still we provide even more land. So this housing cost in these larger cities should drop dramatically, and that's what we would observe. And then because the housing cost dropped dramatically, we do observe the income sale index actually drop a lot in these larger cities, the first tier and second tier city. But of course it increased like dramatically because but it doesn't make any points because the percentage doesn't make any points. I shouldn't mention because the base number is too small. And if you think about the wage sale, it doesn't change much, and it slightly decrease the wage sale because we do encourage much more high-skilled workers into the larger cities. And for the income, for the share, I would just skip. And for the scale premium, so that's the source. Here would be the housing scale premium drop dramatically. So that's the part of this counterfactual. So the takeaway is that yes, the land supply redistribution really helps a lot. And we also do like other policies, but we think this policy is more like doable even today. And our conclusion would be like we analysis the migration and housing costs in China, and we show how this is linked to the measured income inequality. And we also show a migration-based land supply redistribution could lower the income inequality dramatically. So allowing trade of land quota between cities is meaningful. And actually we have a new project going on with another scholar in China. So we do have like the Chinese government is actually literally doing what we're suggesting in this paper starting from this year. And that's my presentation.